Hello, I'm Tom Bradby. Welcome to Talking Politics. It has been pretty sobering stuff. The Nordic countries have been issuing their citizens with updated guidance on how to prepare for war, as a result, they say, of the worsening security situation. So should we be getting similar guidance? And if we were to, what would it say? Meanwhile, inflation is up and Sir Keir Starmer is away again. So we have Angela Rayner for this week's PMQs. I'm joined by Anushka and Harry to discuss all of that and much more. Okay, let's begin with the end of the world. Feels like an appropriate place to begin with. I mean, it's quite serious stuff. I mean, I'm making a bit light of it, but obviously the Swedes and some of the other Nordic countries really aren't. They're issuing guidance about how to deal with World War III. They say as a result of the worsening security situation. Kind of a few interesting things to note. In the Swedish version, they've made a point of putting near the top, "We will never give in," which I just thought was an interesting sort of small sub-point. As far as I'm aware, we don't have any guidance that's similar. I mean, should we? What do you both think of it?
I mean, we don't, and I've just tried 3 government departments to check if any is coming. I don't think any is coming, right. Not imminently. That doesn't mean, by the way, that there's not massive contingency planning going on behind the scenes in this country as well. I mean, these things don't feel serious until they feel really serious. If you just think about the COVID pandemic, I think there was a sense of this isn't going to happen, this isn't going to happen, and then it did happen. And obviously, we have a war between Russia and Ukraine. It is escalating. Vladimir Putin is issuing extra threats. I think one difference between us and Sweden, and actually Germany, where they're also talking in a kind of similar way, is that they are a bit closer to the border. And they are a bit closer to where things could escalate into, and they feel that threat a little bit more kind of in a kind of real way than we do. And also Sweden joining NATO makes it feel like a different game changer for them. But no, I don't think we're going to issue those threats. And just to slightly temper the fear, although it is, I feel, it is quite nerve-wracking. I was just talking to an expert at Chatham House, John Luff, about all of this, about Vladimir Putin often talks about the threat of nukes. And previously when he's done that, and I've spoken to people like John Luff, they've said this is just rhetoric at the moment. They're not really threatening anything extra. In this case, he was arguing that this is really aimed at Germany and Russia's desire to deter Germany from sending tourist missiles into Ukraine, which are particularly long range and which Russia is particularly keen doesn't happen. And at the moment, that is still being blocked from Germany, rather than a message to either us or to the US over what's been happening with Storm Shadow missiles and Joe Biden allowing more missiles to be used directly into Russian territory, because Russia already knew that was going to happen. And so that has not come as a surprise to Vladimir Putin.
I mean, we should be really, people might think, Russia's miles away, we're never going to be at war with Russia. Of course, we should make clear that there are NATO countries right on the border that Vladimir Putin has had a long-standing interest in disrupting, potentially getting involved in, the likes of Estonia, for example, where if he did get involved, plausibly we might be under pressure to actively be at war. I guess, Harry, a lot of it actually depends on what's going on in America, what stance Trump takes, what he thinks about NATO. I think Putin would find some kind of entanglement in Europe a lot more palatable if he didn't think he was going to be up against the US. What do you make of this in the round?
Yeah, that's true. A lot of it depends on whether President Trump's actions match his rhetoric when he comes into office. But I think certainly, it's clear that Europe is sort of preparing for not the level of US support that we've seen in recent years. There's a meeting on Monday happening in Germany between defence ministers of France, Italy, Poland and the UK. And increasingly, you hear that lots of European countries are looking more towards the UK than they have in recent years, because Keir Starmer is basically the only European leader, or one of the only European leaders, in a kind of secure position over the next few years. And last time Donald Trump was president, lots of Europe turned towards Angela Merkel, who was sort of seen as the sort of steady, strong symbol of Western liberal democracies. Well, Germany's not in that position anymore. France, arguably, is not quite in that position anymore. So a lot of attention is turning towards the UK and what sort of support the UK can provide. And I suppose that's a challenge for Keir Starmer in the next few months, to show whether he's up to that task or wants to take on that mantle of being the Western leader who can counteract some of the rhetoric we see from Donald Trump.
Is it credible to think that NATO would be a reasonable fighting force without America? Or is that just realistically, if we don't have America, we're just not remotely at the races in terms of being an effective fighting force against a Russia or anyone else?
I mean, America is obviously a massive, massive part of NATO. It becomes very difficult. The question is, what is Donald Trump saying that is rhetoric or reality? I mean, clearly, it's a complete game changer when he becomes president, because he is going to take a completely different approach to Russia. He's going to try and get towards a position where there is a negotiated deal. Speaking to people, it sounds like that's not going to be a quick and easy deal. This is a really complicated situation. But obviously, there is that question of NATO's Article 5. You know, a strike on a NATO member is a strike on all of us. Will that be the same if Donald Trump is president? Will he react in the same way? I think Russia wants to avoid that situation. But when you talk to people in the military about this, it's not like today they've woken up and said we should really genuinely be worried about Russia. They've been thinking this for some time. And now we have a situation where other countries are lining up with Russia. I mean, we've now seen North Korean troops going into Russia. But also, you know, because of my family background, I'm Indian, I watch Indian television sometimes. They have a completely different take on the Russia-Ukraine conflict than we do in the UK. In India, the suggestion is that this is a much more equal war, and in fact, they're very sympathetic to Russia. How many other countries in the world would you actually find that rhetoric rather than what we hear here? Out of interest,
sorry to press you, but why do you think that is? Because, you know, from a Western perspective, it seems pretty clear. Russia invaded a sovereign nation on its borders. I can't imagine the Indian government is very keen on, you know, Pakistan invading India, for example. So it seems a curious thing. What do you think drives that mindset?
Well, I think some of it is to do with military links between India and Russia, to do with arms trades, to do with the reliance on the Russian economy. Some of it is to do with the fact that they're more prepared to listen to what Vladimir Putin is arguing in this situation, where we would rightly, I think, see that as completely false. But he is making an argument to people in Russia and to some of the other friendly countries about all of this. I don't think what India is going in and is doing and saying, you know, when you watch that kind of coverage, you're saying, you know, Ukraine should have been invaded. But what they're saying is they're taking a much more neutral stance on the current conflict. And the question is, how many other countries are in that position? You know, how many African countries, for example, have very strong links with Russia? I mean, we have a situation in which, you know, what was a Cold War is escalating into something that is really quite scary and has very, very big figures on both sides of the divide. So I don't think necessarily what's happened this week should make us suddenly, you know, start stocking up. But of course, this is a really, really worrying situation.
Harry, we're about to get into PMQs, different from normal. Angela Rayner versus somebody I'm pretty sure the audience will not have heard of, because tradition is the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, does not get up and address the House if the Prime Minister is not there. Could you set some context for us? Who are we going to see today? Who is he?
We'll see Alex Burkhardt, who is the Shadow Cabinet Office Minister, Shadow Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster. He's not a well-known name in the House of Commons. He was a junior minister, I think, at various times in previous governments, but certainly we've not seen a lot of him. And look, I think part of the plan from Kemi Badenoch's team is, you know, their shadow cabinet, when you look at it, it has a lot of names in there that people might not recognise. And, you know, we've got a long time until the next election, but they need to start getting these people out in front of cameras, doing Deputy Prime Minister's questions, things like that, so that they become more well-known, so that the public might start to have some sort of trust or faith in them as we get closer to that next election. But that's a very long task. And this is the first of many names we'll be getting to know, I suspect.
Keir Starmer away again? I mean, like we discussed this last week. I didn't think it was a big deal that he was away a lot. You weren't so sure. Does it matter that he's away again?
I mean, he would have to go to the G20 meeting in Brazil. I don't think you can particularly avoid it. I mean, his argument is wherever I am in the world, I'm still being able to deal with the same situation. But I do think it's the sort of thing that is going to end up with pressure being put on him to be in this country to deal with what's going on at the moment, that it doesn't look great. I mean, like I say, I think he has to be there. I think he should have been at the COP29 meeting last week in Azerbaijan. I can completely see the argument for it. We criticised Rishi Sunak for never going away. I mean, you kind of can't win, can you? Basically.
Not on this podcast, anyway, clearly. So while it was PMQs, it also kind of wasn't, with both Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch not taking part. Instead, Deputy PM Angela Rayner went head-to-head with the Conservatives' Alex Burkhardt. Who is he? you ask? He is the new Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Here are some of the key exchanges from the chamber.
What is the government doing to bring down inflation?
Many people might not know, Mr Speaker, but the Honourable Member was the Minister for Growth when, under Liz Truss, inflation was 11.1% and growth flatlines, so we're doing much better than he did.
High tax, high inflation, low growth, low reform. There's a word for that, Mr Speaker. It's Starmerism.
His party couldn't even get the money out the door for farmers.
Well, perhaps the right honourable lady thinks that everyone came to London yesterday to thank the government.
Farmers told me yesterday that they feel as though they have been betrayed by the Conservatives, but they now feel like they have also been lied to by Labour.
Just a few weeks ago, from that dispatch box, the Minister for Rural Affairs said that he'd been congratulated by a farmer over the introduction of the inheritance tax. Now, I think this farmer must have been a cannabis farmer.
It's good to see the Honourable Member doing well on his bench, once a Labour councillor, then a Tory MP, and now a Reform Chief Whip. Every time he switches party, he gets a promotion.
I don't need any more from the second bench. Can I just say, please, less of it. We've had a bit of a run-in recently, and I don't need to have any more.
Our Chancellor in the last 4 months has shown more competence than the last 4 Chancellors that he had.
Let's play theatre critics, cheap theatre critics for a moment. So this is quite aside from policy. Alex Burghardt, new to this job. Let's give him and Angela Rayner marks out of 10 on today then.
Marks?
I thought he did all right, actually. I thought Alex Burghardt, I thought he made some good points. I thought he was a little bit shouty. You heard the microphone sort of...
a little bit.
Yeah, it was a bit overblown a few times, and he was slightly overly enthusiastic, which, can often happen in those situations when you've not done a PMQs before and there's a bit more noise in the chamber than there usually is. And that, I think he got a bit swept up in that. But, I thought he kind of hit the key points that you'd want to hit the government with this week. So...
I thought it was quite good when he turns to a colleague and he basically names a farm in his constituency or mentions a farm in his constituency and is able to specifically say, this is the amount of money they raise, this is the amount of money that it's going to be hit with. She had clearly, Angela Rayner, prepared for farming questions. I mean, they obviously realised they were going to be hit with a lot of them. I did think again, which I thought about Kemi Badenoch last week, there wasn't quite the thread of an argument from the beginning to the end of the questions, which I sometimes think is what this... I think the most kind of impact you can have as the leader of the opposition or Alex Burghardt is to take an argument and drive it through all of your questions, although I'm sure some people disagree on that.
OK, to be provocative, I'd give him 4 out of 10. Too shouty, too pointy.
I'd go higher.
Really? And I thought... Your point about farming, I thought was really good. Good to have a real example, assuming it all checks out, which I'm sure it will. I thought that was quite clever. Showed promise, could get a lot better. Might be quite good at it, but needs to... I'd give Angela Rayner quite high marks. I think she's always really entertaining and handles it well, whereas Keir Starmer looks like he's having his teeth ground out and it's just incredibly tedious to watch. Fair? Do you think I'm overrating?
I was going to go 6 each.
I was going to say exactly the same.
Okay.
But
I defer to your better judgment.
In my book club, I always go higher on my scores. Maybe you're just a bit meaner than me. In as much as I thought it's a tough gig, people don't really know who you are. You're going there. He laid some decent points. He landed them. Totally agree. Way too shouty. And she was good. She's always good.
Yeah.
She responded on those points. But I do think it's a difficult issue that they're struggling with at the moment. I thought she defended Rachel Reeves quite well a couple of times through
Rachel
that.
Reeves, who literally looks like a... I mean, she looked so exhausted before the budget and looks... Doesn't she? I mean, you
definitely
looks more like
a little bit
relaxed a bit and... I mean, you could see the strain.
It's also interesting because actually the farming thing arguably is quite a difficult thing for them to deal with at the moment.
Yeah.
But,
inflation figures not good.
Not great. But, I think, and I think they may be being a little bit complacent on this, but, I was speaking to someone yesterday. Their basic view is this isn't going to be the issue that they're going to be worrying about at the next election. The thing they're going to be worrying about in the next election is, are people getting more GP appointments more quickly? Have their A&E waitings times gone down? Are they actually feeling a bit better off? And actually, I've seen some polling on the budget which definitely says farmers have been hard hit. Actually, pensioners also people see as very hard hit. When you ask how hard hit were you, the numbers are a little bit more balanced. But that said, I think I think the thing about inheritance tax, and I think the thing about farmers in particular, is in a way it punches above the weight. You know, it might not hit that many people. Obviously, there's an argument about the actual numbers, but farms are often at the heart of a community. I've actually been speaking to people in some seats where Labour won from the Conservatives, but they're quite marginal still, and all the kind of local social media, apparently, Facebook groups, etc., is alive with arguments about farmers, and basically people are very angry. You could see yesterday in London that there is real fury about it. I do think it is a problem for them, because I think it's, again, something that makes it look like people don't trust them to have done what they said they would.
I'm probably being a bit hard on Alex. I'll mark him up a bit.
You've been sick worrying about that, haven't you?
No, it's fine. But I can see, given it was his first start, it wasn't a bad first go for sure. And I just always mark her up because I just think she's entertaining.
Maybe we should give her a slightly higher mark, because she is really good at it.
Anyway, I defer to you. But on the substance, Harry, do you think the issues around farming and the decisions the government's made is damaging?
Yeah, I think potentially. I mean, I suppose that the thing we don't know is, look, there's this huge disagreement about the numbers, and the government are absolutely convinced that this is only going to affect a minority of farmers. And if you speak to the NFU and farmers, they think the complete opposite, and they think the government have got their numbers wrong, and they don't understand the scale of this issue. And in truth, we won't really know, for another few years when these farms start having to go through this process, and if we see farms start to close down. So that's one issue. But I think the other thing about farming is, I've spent the last week chatting to lots of backbench Labour MPs in rural areas, some of them newly elected at the last election. And normally when you get an issue like this, where there's protests on the streets and there's lots of controversy about it, what MPs will say to you is, look, I can't say this publicly, but privately I'm really worried about this. The government have got it wrong. I'm making the case to the Treasury to change this. And certainly the ones I spoke to, none of them said that to me. Now, there might be others who are making that argument, but I just don't get the sense that internally there's a huge amount of pressure from MPs for the Treasury to change their position.
I think it makes quite a big difference what your constituency looks like, and that some of the seats we're talking about where they'll have large rural populations are the ones that Labour didn't really expect to win, and they're perhaps the ones that they're going to find hardest to hold on to. But I actually remember when I did an economics degree many years ago, I remember a lesson where they actually said, basically politically, you should never hit farmers, because they are a kind of case study for a group that's quite small but incredibly well organised and has huge public sympathy. And one thing that I was told by two different people yesterday, including someone quite senior in the Labour Party, was that people have been saying you shouldn't hit people who are characters in children's books, because those are people who people are really...
This conversation is so going places I didn't expect, but keep going, this is fascinating.
Because they're people who people are really sympathetic with.
Yeah.
You have Farmer Ted, you read it to your kids.
Yeah.
It's like community people, you shouldn't hit farmers, you shouldn't hit firefighters. Who else do you have in children's books?
Yeah. That sounds like good politics. Let's talk about the economy. We've always said, haven't we, that in the end this government has staked its reputation on winning the economic argument, on getting growth. That is obviously key. The inflation figures today are not good. Let's all agree on that. We can debate exactly what it's about. I think it'd be interesting to talk about a broader point, which is we've got incoming Trump officials saying, look, you guys have got to decide. Are you going to tilt towards us, or are you going to tilt back to Europe? You're kind of in the middle in nowheresville. Not wrong about that. Actually, we are sort of in the middle, not quite knowing quite which way. If you're a big fan of Brexit, you probably think we haven't taken advantage of Brexit freedoms. I think even if you're not, you probably think we haven't really taken any advantage of it. What do you think of that? And which way do we go? And do we end up tacking back to Europe? Is that where we get growth, or do we tack to America? What's the answer?
Well, I think it's quite difficult. And I think what Keir Starmer's not going to do is suddenly stand up to Donald Trump. I think there's going to be continued, at least some sucking up to Donald Trump. The difficulty they've got is they've staked their reputation on growth, and now they've got the reality of the Office for Budget Responsibility being unbelievably cautious on the things that they think will drive growth. I mean, they literally didn't score planning reform at all as driving any growth whatsoever, although the OBR say we will keep an eye on the details, but made clear they're sceptical about it. Green investment, I mean, the OBR scores it in the longer term, but not before, well, not massively before the next election. They do a little bit, which again might be the right thing for Rachel Reeves to do, but it's not necessarily going to win her capital politically, which leaves you, OK, well, what will the OBR score? And a couple of things they'll score. One is immigration. Well, the government's not about to say we should ramp up immigration. The other is, can you do decent trade deals? Either can you do more, with the EU than they seem to be flirting with, although I do think Keir Starmer clearly wants to reset that relationship, or do we get a trade deal with the US? But reminder, if we get a trade deal with the US, we'll be serving up chlorinated chicken probably next time we come to meet. It's going to be controversial, it's going to be difficult. Donald Trump, as we've seen previously, isn't about to suddenly agree to something. He's someone who wants to make sure that anything massively benefits American people, certainly not British people. So I think it is actually, that doesn't really answer your question. It basically says it's incredibly difficult, but I think both of those relationships are so important given how much economic growth is at the heart of what they want to achieve.
What do you think, Harry?
Yeah, both.
To Europe or America, or we're stuck in the middle?
Well, I think if the Prime Minister was here, he would say both. He would say, that you don't have to choose between those two.
But in reality, we need to do something, don't we? We're not going to get growth unless we kind of break the mould of where we are. At least it doesn't look like we are. And there are possibilities. You just decide to suck it up and say, right, we're going to have to do some unpalatable stuff, but we've got to get a deal with the US. We've got to get closer to the US. We've got to deregulate and do some of the stuff the US is about to do. Or we just accept our future is with you. I mean, there are good arguments both ways.
Yeah.
Arguments people like both ways. We're just stuck in no man's land.
I would suggest that the deal with Europe is an easier one to do, but politically more difficult back at home. Whereas the deal with the US, I think, is a lot harder to negotiate, but I don't think there's as much controversy back here in the UK about doing those sort of deals. So again, that's the sort of trade-off that you've got to make.
But also the big things you're talking about, which is like rejoining the single market, we're not going to do that. We're just not going to go there. Keir Starmer is really clear, because in order to do that, you have to have free movement. The Labour Party believes that the Brexit vote was predicated on people not wanting free movement. They're not willing to go there. They're struggling to go there with a youth mobility scheme.
People have changed their minds since then.
Well, I don't think people have changed their mind on immigration per se. I mean, there's absolutely opposite of that. And again, speaking to figures in the Labour Party, they think that one of the big things they'll be judged on at the next election, as well as the NHS and the economy, is immigration. So I don't think they're suddenly going to, change the relationship we have with Europe on that basis. I mean, we've talked about it before that a customs union is something that Keir Starmer always seemed more interested in, but he made clear in the election we're not going there either. So all the deals that you can do with Europe are kind of, in kind of much more, not niche, but specific areas. And I think he will do everything he can to do that. His reset with the EU is all quite serious. But I think actually over all of that, is the security cooperation because of the situation with Russia.
Final question to you both. Can we just talk about, I've been thinking about it a bit this week. Some people watching this programme will like Donald Trump, some people won't like Donald Trump. One thing we can probably all agree on, because I think it's just an objective fact, is that a lot of the things that Donald Trump said and Donald Trump has done would have been disqualifying for such high office in any other era of American politics. That much has changed. So you're left with people in America having decided, we understand that Donald Trump has said and done these things, but we don't care, or we just don't believe it. So we can debate which one of those is true. But clearly, those previously disqualifying things in American politics are no longer disqualifying. I think if you look at British politics, the personality of the leader, if you look at the last 10 or 15 years, is really critical. I mean, ultimately, you could argue Boris Johnson, he was very popular on policy terms just won a big election, did ultimately get booted out for questions of character. So this is a very long and involved question, but essentially what I'm getting around to asking you both is, do you think what we've seen in America, this kind of shift to populism and this sort of change in us thinking we don't care about those things anymore, we want this kind of populist leader, is that happening here? Do we see the rise of Nigel Farage, or do you both, Harry, you've spent a lot of time with Nigel Farage, so let's start with you, or do you think ultimately that's unlikely in a British context?
I think there's elements of it here, but
it's the longest question ever.
Yeah, I think there's elements of it here, but I do think it's less likely in this country than in the US. Well, I just think as a society we're not as polarised as America yet. We might be heading in that direction, but we're certainly a long way behind that. And I would argue that what we've just seen in the last election, I mean, Keir Starmer is hardly a populist. He's not someone who's got oodles of personality, I think, and he's been elected Prime Minister fairly comfortably, despite his personal approval ratings being quite low. But look, certainly Nigel Farage is sort of the biggest indication of that sort of element of populism. And I spent a lot of time with the Reform Party last year, and Reform, if you look at them in local elections before Nigel Farage took hold, they were underperforming their national polling level. They couldn't reach the levels that they were supposed to, and lots of people inside Reform were really frustrated at the fact they just couldn't break through in council elections and in by-elections. And then Farage comes along, and everything changes, and Reform, go up in the polls. They managed to win 5 seats at the election. So certainly from their perspective, having that personality and figurehead at the top of it has massively benefited them. And their plan is to, over the next 5 years, absolutely latch onto Nigel and try and harness that populism that they've seen in the US, try and echo it over here and see and test that theory out and see if it can work over here. So,
Harry said we're not as polarised as the US yet, and I think I would agree with that. We're not. But there is increasing polarisation on the way. There's a kind of would say most people think quite a lot of the media that is right-wing has drifted a bit further to the right. You've got these big new players like GB News and so on the right. Obviously, they think they're tackling the biases they would see it of mainstream media. But do you think there is every chance we will drift America's way, or are we just fundamentally different?
I mean, I think absolutely, there are things that have happened in American society that are happening in our society. And although I agree with you, obviously the election of Keir Starmer is very different to the election of Donald Trump. Actually, there are some ways in which those are similar results, in that the country was absolutely fed up with the incumbent government and it gave it a massive kick. And, there are plenty of people who think that that's one of the things that happened to the Democrats, that they were really suffering because of that post-COVID incumbency factor. So, therefore, and we've said this before, I think the next election, anything could happen. It's really, really hard to tell. I don't think the size of Labour's majority tells us that Labour are odds on to win the next election for sure, but it will depend on what happens over the next time. In fact, already I think the Tories are ahead of them in the polls, which I kind of find quite extraordinary. But what I do think is interesting, and I was talking to an MP about this, and we were talking about the issue of trust, and I think that this is the thing that underpins all of this, which is there has been a dramatic collapse in trust across the Western world in institutions, and that in dealing with that, people were looking for kind of solutions as to who's going to be the person who's going to fix these issues for me. And in Donald Trump's case, they didn't care actually about all the personal stuff. It didn't matter, because they believe actually that practically he will do things that will improve their lives. And it wasn't just polarisation. It was over 70 million people who voted for Donald Trump. There's probably quite a lot of moderates in America who voted for Donald Trump, ignoring the personal stuff because they think that he's going to do something that will change their lives. Now, I think that underlying issue absolutely exists here. We've had the same collapse in trust. We've had the same disbelief that things can actually change as a result of politicians. And the conversation I was having with this MP was, I was saying that, the freebie scandal for Keir Starmer, had that been a real blow for the Labour Party in hitting trust? And their argument back to me was they didn't think that was as important as that bigger point about institutional trust. If Labour can't prove that it's actually going to change people's lives, then we're going to end up with a very similar phenomenon to what we've seen in America, because people's belief in our political system will continue to decline. And it's already in a very, very bad shape in this country already. So I absolutely think we could head in that direction. Whether it's Farage and Reform, or whether it's a different leader of the Conservative Party, or even perhaps at some point a different leader of the Labour Party, I think is hard to say. Because in a way, Donald Trump isn't really a Republican in terms of the traditional sense of it. He's a character who has managed to inspire tens of millions of people.
Or whether it's Boris Johnson coming back again,
well,
inspired by the return of Donald Trump.
Can I say somebody wrote that down as a little prediction from me? Yeah. I think there's every chance that Boris Johnson could end up coming back. The one thing that the person pointed out when we were discussing this yesterday is the current Conservative Party, the MPs, are not a particularly pro-Johnson group, because a lot of them lost their seats.
Do you think he would come back as leader of Reform?
No.
Because Reform wouldn't have him, or because he would never do
He's
it?
a Tory.
Yeah, he wouldn't do it.
Actually,
He wouldn't be interested.
But if he couldn't, if it was clear the Tories wouldn't have him back as leader, I mean, I just asked this question, only idea popped into my head literally 10 seconds ago, and it's probably a damn stupid one, but I just thought,
I mean, the one thing where I think
inconceivable.
I can see where it comes from is that Reform are trying to hit the same sweet spot that Boris Johnson managed to hit in 2019, which is an economically slightly to the left position paired with a kind of cultural position, which is much more to the right. And you know, the kind of anti-woke stuff, part of me used to say, you can't win elections with that stuff. But it is interesting that although Donald Trump, and we say this as an economy election, it was also an anti-woke election.
Yeah.
And the number of people who actually voted for Donald Trump who were motivated by anti-woke issues, like, for example, his anti-trans stance, is quite
all
telling.
I'm saying is, we know Boris Johnson is extremely ambitious and remains extremely ambitious. Were he to become an MP again, maybe he becomes a Tory MP and then he doesn't become Tory leader, were he to lead an exodus of right-wing Tory MPs through Reform, to be Reform's leader, I mean, I'm wargaming here. It's probably a
What would he do on the one of the things he
If it
really
was
cared
clear-
about was climate change.
Yeah.
I mean, Reform are basically going to scrap net zero,
Yeah.
apparently save £30 billion from that, although I haven't seen any figures that prove to me that what they're saying is true. That feels like quite a jar with Boris Johnson. I mean, he's not here for us to ask.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised.
But, yeah.
Do you really think that Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson could both survive at the same time?
Well,
Come on.
that's all for this week. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, whether you were watching or listening. Remember, you can view new episodes on ITVX every Wednesday or thereafter. And if you're enjoying it, please do hit subscribe on your favourite podcast platform to ensure you won't miss out on an episode. But that's it. Goodbye.